Open House. Written by Anthony James Mazza. Performed by Stephen Ozerchuk. The call came in at about 2 a.m. and it was our turn to go. Outside, the storm raged, its electrical surges tripping alarms all over town. Investigation was an act of futility. Mother Nature was the only intruder, but we had to go, just in case. Protect and serve and all that jazz. My partner, Mike, drove us out there, laughing and talking about a girl he'd hooked up with the night before. He was senior and called the shots, and that worked for me. He knew his stuff, the quintessential street cop, but he was also a jovial guy that made the night shift bearable. Mike liked being a cop, all of it but the paperwork, which he assigned to me from day one. The first time I turned in a report, the sergeant gave it a glance, snickered, and said, "Nice writing, Shakespeare." And the name just sort of stuck. In the few years we were partners, Mike and I thought we had been everywhere in our town, but our destination that night was new. The Garrison house stood alone on over 100 acres of privately owned land. Mabel Garrison, the property owner, was fighting the long Alzheimer's fight in a retirement home downstate, so the house sat empty and dark, and until that night, quiet. The drive there felt like forever. The storm dropped off, and there was nothing to break up the lightless back roads except occasional flashes of remnant lightning. Just outside of town, our headlights outlined farmland and then gave way to fields and then an endless forest. The trees were enormous and old, reaching their twisted branch hands across the road, clicking stick fingers against the roof of our patrol car. The starless night left Mike and I isolated. He jawed on about his date, teeth flashing green in the dashboard light. We drove slow, keeping an eye out for deer. This far out, they should have been everywhere, but we saw none. The trees fell back at last to a clearing which framed a large 3-story cobblestone house which sat kitty-corner to a barn. Mike parked between the two and killed the lights. "We'll take this bad boy first," he said, thumbing on his flashlight and striding toward the barn. I drew my sidearm. "Try not to shoot me in the ass, okay, Shakespeare?" Mike said, chuckling. It was his standard line. He pushed open the sliding door and stepped inside, vanishing as neatly as if the barn had swallowed him. I followed. It was empty. No stalls, no grain bins or hay lofts, just one auditorium-sized room with nothing in it. The air was cold and stale. Mike panned his light from the ceiling rafters down the wooden studs and onto the floor. We found nothing but a door on the far side of the barn. We crossed over and tested the knob. It turned easily, opening to a long and narrow room. The smell was different here, dank and earthy. One of the walls was covered with stainless steel, and crouching in front of it, an elongated tub angled downward on one side. It had 2 bays, one much larger than the other, separated by a heavy slab of wood that looked like an old cattle yoke. "What kind of tub is that?" I asked. "The slaughtering kind," Mike said. "You heard the critter in facing that way." He motioned to the smaller bay. "Lock it down with that collar and slit the throat. The blood runs downhill into the drain." He trained the flashlight on the sink a moment longer, then raised the beam onto the stainless steel wall and ceiling. An axe hung there, gleaming dully in the artificial light. Keeping it company was a large mallet and several butchering knives. In the corner, a pale-colored bone saw tipped awkwardly on its own shelf. Mike swung the light higher still, picking out 3 huge meat hooks that hung from the ceiling in an obscene gesture. He squatted by the sink and ran a finger down one side. "Hello? What's up?" I asked. Mike glanced back at me. "It's clean." He climbed onto the tub, reached up and touched the axe head. So is this. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. According to the property checklist, this house had been empty for years. There might be a caretaker or someone who looked in on the place now and again, but cleaning an unused butchering tub in an empty barn seemed an unlikely duty. And why, for that matter, were there any tools here at all? "Let's finish up," I said. "This place gives me the creeps." "Keep your shirt on," Mike said, scanning the rest of the room from his vantage point on the tub. "It's probably just a neighboring farmer helping himself to the facilities. This room is definitely set up for—" His voice trailed off as he leaned forward looking at something. He jumped off the tub and walked to the far side of the room. In his flashlight beam, I spotted the generator sitting on the floor. Mike touched the carburetor and sniffed his fingers. He nodded. "Gas. On the fresher side, I'd say. Come on. Let's see what the house is doing." We exited the barn and crossed the drive, circling the cobblestone through hip-deep grass. The back door was boarded over, as were all 3 stories of windows, all but one, on the 3rd floor which faced the driveway in the barn. Lightning flashed again, and I saw a tattered lace curtain behind the window's dingy glass. We came around to the front entrance. It was a massive double door with a hasp lock shutting out the world. A sign hung from the 2 handles. The words written were drawn in crayon, the scribblings of a child. No trespassing. There were small marks around the padlock keyhole where the metal had been scratched raw, but the lock was in place and intact. I turned to leave. "Where do you think you're going?" Mike said. "Back to the car," I said. "The house is secure." "Secure?" Mike lunged forward, slamming one big shoulder into the door. The screws holding the clasp gave way with a brittle popping sound, and the lock dropped to the ground. One door swung inward a few inches. Mike looked back at me. "Front door's open, partner. We better take a look." I knew better than to say anything. Mike drew his weapon, placing the flashlight on top of his gun and locking the 2 together in his mitt-sized hands. I followed suit. Mike pushed the door all the way open. The interior was blackness, and we hesitated, giving our eyes a chance to adjust to the deeper darkness inside the house. A hallway stretched out in front of us, with 2 closed doors on the right side and an opening to a large room on the left. Mike went left and dropped low. I remained standing and moved to his right to cover him. Mike lit up the room, and I heard his sharp intake of breath just as I caught my own. A naked man leaned against the wall. His eyes were closed and his face frozen in a grimace that was too stiff to be real. "Nice statue," Mike muttered. The crucified Christ was life-size, nailed to what appeared to be a real wooden cross. The pain on the statue's face was unbelievably realistic. "Jesus," I mumbled. "What gave it away?" Mike whispered back, chuckling. He stood up and checked the rest of the room, pausing here and there to look behind pieces of furniture. I watched the hallway, my eyes trained on the closed doors. Mike came up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder. "We're good here. Next." He moved past me into the hall, dropped again, and eased open the first door. We found the remnants of a twin bed and a small dresser. On the dresser was a yellow doily with some figurines lying across it. Mike checked under the bed and turned around. "Clear. Next room." "Just a sec." I took a closer look at the figurines. A Virgin Mary, another Jesus much smaller than its cousin across the hall, and some saints. A few of the figurines were painted, others colorless, but all of them had one thing in common. They were headless. "You looking for souvenirs, Shakespeare?" Mike said from behind me. "I've read about this." "So have I," Mike said dryly. "The penal code calls it vandalism. Come on, next room." Another bedroom. No statues here, but a copy of the Lord's Prayer lay in a broken picture frame. The lightly dusted glass fragments peppered the floor. Someone had written over parts of the prayer in thin longhand. "Our Father, who art in Hades, hallowed be this ground. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in Hades. Give us this day our daily feast, and forgive us our trespasses, as we offer those who trespass against us. Lead us to thy pure desecration. Salah." "Mike, take a look at this." Keeping an eye on the door, Mike squatted down and read it quickly. "Creative. Salah? What does that mean?" "No idea," I said, shaking my head. "But the satanic stuff is clear enough." Mike grunted. "It's some messed up kids getting their adrenaline going. Stop reading into things, Shakespeare. Let's keep moving." We continued through the first floor. Religious artifacts were everywhere, and some of them were altered. We cleared the last room and discovered a large staircase. Following its crooked banister up to the 2nd and 3rd floors, I noticed the first of the red splotches on the 3rd step. Mike scratched at it with his pocket knife. "Wax," he said quietly. "Looks like it keeps going," I said, pointing the flashlight beam onto the other steps higher up. "Is it fresh?" "Hard to tell, but let's play it safe." He climbed the first 2 steps and strobed the flashlight as far up the stairwell as his position allowed. "Go back to the car and grab the shotgun. It's too damn dark in here for just a pistol. When you're out there, check in with headquarters." "Do you want backup?" "For what? A wax investigation? Just let 'em know that we're going through the house." "What are you going to do?" Mike glanced back up the stairs. "Just gonna watch the fort." I hesitated. Mike was not a regulations guy, but he always followed the book on building searches. Rule 1 said we stayed together until the search was done. "Look, we already cleared the first floor," Mike said, reading my mind. He flipped the light back toward the front door. "These stairs are the only way down. If we both leave, we'll have to start from the beginning. I don't want to be here all night. Understood? It should only take you a minute to grab the gun." "I got it." I headed toward the front door, then stopped and looked back at the staircase. In the darkness of the house, I saw only the vaguest silhouette of Mike's form. "Mike?" "What now, Shakespeare?" "Don't go up there without me. Hurry up." I reached the car in time to hear headquarters calling our number. "Base to 380. I keyed the mic. 380. "State police contacted us regarding your location." 10-4, I said, "and?" "They responded to that same location 3 months ago." I toggled the switch again. "They find anything?" "That's negative, 380. Premise was secure." Received. I paused for a moment, then added, "Are there any other notes in their report?" "Negative, 380. Everything was... Wait, there is one thing. They found a crucifix buried in the front yard." "Copy that," I said. "No surprise there. From what we've seen so far, the owner was pretty religious." 380. This cross was buried upside down." I grabbed the shotgun and sprinted for the house. When I reached the stairs, Mike was gone. "Mike," I called softly. There was no answer. "Mike," I said, louder this time. Again, nothing. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, feeling my heart speed up. Thoughts fired wildly through my head like BBs in a shooting gallery. Maybe he's just testing me, I thought, standing in a doorway and watching to see what I'll do. Wouldn't be the first time. Nothing like a real situation to make it sink in, he always said, on-the-job training. But this wasn't the time, and I knew it. I shone my flashlight on the stairs, illuminating the wax blot by sheer luck. "Damn it, Mike," I whispered. I gripped the shotgun with hands that felt like ice. He could have gone ahead. Maybe he wanted to take a quick look just to the top of the stairs until I got back. But I pushed the thought away quickly. Mike wouldn't do it without letting me know. The house was too dark to guess who was who, an easy recipe to shoot one another. But what if he had heard something? Something that couldn't wait and had to be checked out immediately? I shook it off. From a tactical standpoint, Mike's standpoint, that made no sense. He'd wait for me to get back before investigating. The house had no tenants to protect, therefore not worth any unnecessary risk. It's only abandoned property. Abandoned if you ignore the fresh scratches on the padlock and the candle wax on the floors. Mike called the intruders kids, but what kind of kids buried a cross upside down in the front yard? Were they still here? Where the hell are you, Mike? My fear climbed another notch, and I forced myself to breathe deeper in response, trying to relax, to think of a good reason for Mike to have moved. But there wasn't a good reason. I knew it. Mike hadn't moved. Not voluntarily. "It was time for you to move," my mind screamed, but my body didn't react. There was too much real estate in his house to cover alone. Mike could be in one of the rooms that we've already checked, or somewhere up those stairs. I toggled the switch on my portable radio, calling headquarters for backup. There was no answer. I cranked the volume knob and tried again. Still nothing. I switched channels and heard only silence. I looked at the cobblestone walls and groaned. They were cutting off my signal. I looked back at the front door. The radio in the car. I would call for backup and then start the perimeter search again from the... The noise was subtle, but there, cutting through my thoughts completely. I tried to place it, an exhalation of breath, a sigh, perhaps something sliding across the floor. I couldn't be sure. The only thing that was clear was that it came from somewhere upstairs, the second floor, maybe the third. I pictured Mike lying up there, injured or worse. And of course, he might not be alone. I went into motion, unloading the shotgun and pocketing the shells and leaving the empty gun by the stairs. It was worthless to me now. I needed an extra hand for the flashlight and the ability to move unencumbered. My pistol was my best option. I moved up the stairs cautiously, but quickly, gun drawn, strobing the flashlight sporadically from different points, then turning it off to hide my position as best I could, following the only lead I had, the wax spots, and listening for the sound again. As I approached the second floor, I clicked off the light and dropped low, hugging the ground to make myself the smallest target possible, listening. I heard nothing. I peered over the top step and flashed the second floor, looking for Mike. To my left was a hallway with several rooms, doors wide open, and to my right a single door, this one closed. The wax splotches left the stairs and trailed in an uneven line to the closed door. The beam from my flashlight flickered and yellowed. I groaned. I hadn't charged the battery the night before. I rushed quickly down the hallway and squatted by the closed door, blinking my flashlight down the hall as I did so. There was no movement. I gripped the doorknob and paused as Mike had taught me to do long ago, listening, preparing to go in low. There was no sound. I thrust the door open and hit the light. A light shone back at me, blinding me. I rolled out of the doorway, adrenaline surging. "Mike!" But there was no answer. "Mike!" Still no answer. It was the bad guy then, and in my mind, Mike was already dead. I rolled back across the doorway, gun hand fully extended, calculated where I'd seen the light, and estimated where the bastard's torso would be. I pulled the trigger twice as I rolled, hearing the guns roar and feeling the recoil in my hand. Glass shattered and something hit the floor. I slid to one side, raised the gun, and flipped on my light. All the slack was taken out of my trigger, and I was ready to fire again. But no one was there. The bad guy had been a full-length mirror. It reflected my own light back at me. Now the mirror was in 1,000 sparkling pieces, mixed atop a score of wax drops. The wax led to the only other thing in the room, an empty closet door. I leaned back and checked the hall again, listening. All was quiet. The flashlight was getting weaker and I could barely see to the end of the hallway. I returned to the closet and peered inside. It was shallow and empty except for one spot where my light dropped further back. I reached forward and shoved a loose panel over. It opened, revealing a narrow, box-shaped passage, a hidden passage. Old houses sometimes had these, and I wondered how many others were in the house. I pictured Mike standing on the first floor, watching the stairs, assuming everything to his back had been checked and was clear, then the wall behind him quietly sliding open. I shook my head and focused. The passage was roughly 2 by 3 feet. I flashed my light beam into its gullet and grimaced. The wax continued down the passage. To follow, I would have to crawl. Sheer panic for the claustrophobic man I was. Turning around, should the need arise, would be near impossible. I brought the light down onto the tunnel floor directly in front of me. A larger patch of wax lay just inside the entrance, as if the candle-bearer had hesitated there, perhaps waiting for something. There was an impression in the wax. Triangles, framed with concentric circles, ran diagonal to the edge of a curved rim. I bit down hard onto my bottom lip and moaned. I was looking at the partial footprint of a Timberland work boot, the very same style of boot favored by police personnel all over the country. I was wearing a pair at that moment. The print in the wax was larger than mine, and that, of course, made perfect sense. Mike's feet were bigger. I glanced over my shoulder to the emptiness of the room and then ahead into the dark passage. My stomach clenched. I didn't want to go in there. Everything I knew, everything Mike had taught me warned against it. Once inside, I would be a fish in a barrel, no place to duck, hide, or run. The training books called it a fatal funnel, but Mike had gone in there, of that I was sure, and the ticking clock screamed at me. Each second counted. My decisions must be quick, and where else would I go with any hope of finding him? I dropped to my stomach and wormed my way forward, a soldier's crawl, pulling with my elbows, keeping the gun and the flashlight in my hands. I turned the flashlight on and off, trying to conserve the fading light. The tunnel was flat for the first 10 feet, and then climbed upward, heading, I assumed, to the 3rd floor. The temperature rose as I crawled, though whether it was because of the house or my efforts, I couldn't tell. The boards under me grew damp and slimy, soaking into my elbows and knees. The telltale puddles of wax appeared every few feet, though I saw no more prints embedded in them. On the tunnel ceiling, black smudges crisscrossed the raw wood, left there by the dripping candle I now followed. A putrid stench rose from the floor, subtle at first, but it got stronger as I went further into the passage. In the confined space, the sound of my labored breathing was maddening. Wood splinters dug into my skin, and a sharp ache cut into my back muscles. I kept moving, trying not to think about Mike's disappearance or the size of the tunnel, but there was no escaping the weakening flashlight. Each time I turned it off, the darkness was absolute. I had never experienced such a pure absence of light. From my elbows back, my body was invisible, drowned in inky blackness. The outer periphery of the flashlight beam had a crisp edge to it, as if it had been clipped off by silent black shears. I looked behind me and saw nothing. It was like gazing into a starless universe. I faced forward and crawled on, feeling the tunnel turn sharply and steepen its ascent. The flashlight dimmed into a yellow-brown beam once again. I shook it briskly, and it brightened briefly and then faded back. The battery was on its last legs. Please, God, don't let it go out. If it dies in here, I'll go mad. I had to holster my weapon and the light. With empty hands I moved faster, feeling my way forward, the floor of the passage still climbing upward. My heart was pounding now, my muscles screaming for rest. I paused to catch my breath, and I heard something behind me. It was a muffled, dragging sound, like a heavy laundry bag being pulled across the wooden floor. I froze in place and held my breath. The noise stopped. I started forward, and it came on again, louder. I rolled onto my back, grabbed the flashlight, and thumbed the button. The weak light penetrated the tunnel. There was nothing as far back as I could see. Staying in the same position, I walked backwards, my eyes facing behind me. The sound came again, and I hit the switch. The light flashed bright again, pulling on the last reserves of the batteries and filling the passage. In that moment, at that very limit of its reach, I saw something peripheral to the light. Blurred and distorted, perhaps by the darkness, perhaps by my fear, I can't say. It was a face, a white mask of features that stretched into contorted angles and blended into the particles of the lightless tunnel, merging with them, then separating once again. Empty sockets glared back at me, and in their dark, fathomless depths it seemed that something even darker wriggled. I shrieked aloud, leaned forward to see better, and my body shuddered in panic. The flashlight went out. I shook it frantically, but this time there was no resurgence of power, no welcomed return of illumination. Darkness enveloped me. Desperately, I pawed at the bottom of the flashlight, planning to rotate the batteries inside and get a few minutes more. I gripped the base and twisted hard, too hard. The bottom popped off, and 2 batteries spilled out and began rolling down the descending floorboards. No! I groped blindly for them and managed to catch one. The other glanced off my leg and rolled on, picking up speed as it went. It stopped suddenly and quietly, as if it had rolled into something soft or had been snatched up by greedy hands. It's the face, I thought. The face is rushing toward me now under the perfect cloak of darkness, dragging a bloated sack of torso behind it, coming for me as it had come for my partner. I would have screamed, but couldn't find my voice. I needed light. I slapped desperately at my pants pockets, feeling only bits of paper and loose change. My shirt pockets were empty, but beneath the pockets I felt my body armor and remembered the matches Mike gave me on my first day on the job. Here, keep these in your vest pocket. What for? I asked him. Mike shrugged. Matches are like pocket knives. You never know when they'll come in handy. The pack had been there for years, and I'd never thought about them, much less replace them. I reached under my shirt and found the small, flat square on my vest, nearly weeping with relief. Would they work? Hadn't I washed the vest once or twice during that time? How many times had I stood in the rain directing traffic? Something knocked against the tunnel below me, or maybe it was just the sound of my heart thudding in my ears. I opened the matchbook, tore one of the matches free, and struck it. Nothing. I tried a second one and felt the match head dissolve in my fingers. Come on, come on! The stench of decay hit my nostrils again, stronger now as I tried the third match. Half of the matchback peeled away with the effort, and still no flame. The sound of my own breathing seemed louder, more contained, like the passage had suddenly grown smaller, as if something was filling up the tunnel space behind me. I walked backwards again as fast as I could, matches gripped in one hand and the flashlight in the other, feeling the slime of the boards soaking through my uniform. The The pain in my back and shoulder blades was crippling. The tunnel was narrowing, its walls brushing up against my arms. I threw the useless flashlight into the darkness behind me, willing it to strike whatever moved there. But like the battery, there was no sound. I had thrown the flashlight into a void. Frantically, I pulled more matches off the book as I continued to worm backwards, striking one after another with no success. Jesus Christ, please! Thumbing the pack, I felt 2 matches left. I pulled these off and, using just my legs, kicked myself backwards a final time, feeling my head bump against something hard. I shrieked aloud. Reaching behind my head, I felt a wall. No! Blindly, I felt the tunnel all around me, looking for an opening. There was none. It simply ended. There was no place to go but back where I had come from, back to the closet, or back to whatever it was that was moving toward me. From someplace deep in the house, far below me, I heard a voice, muffled through the sweating walls and cluttered rooms. It was the briefest utterance, a single syllable, unintelligible and despairing. I struck the last 2 matches together in desperation. There was a slight whiff of sulfur, and then they flared alight. I flinched, blinded by the radiance. As my eyes adjusted, I touched the flame to the book itself and held it up, looking back the way I had come. There was nothing there. Nothing. It didn't seem possible. The flame began to die. I faced forward to confirm the tunnel's dead end. The flame burned my fingers, and I dropped the matches. They landed on top of a metal hinge. A closer look, and I saw 2 of them. It was a door, a trap door. I had crawled right over it in my panic without realizing it. I pushed down on the opposite side, and it swung open easily beneath me. The matchbook cinder fell through and continued down at least 10 feet before it went out. I couldn't tell if it reached the bottom or simply burned out as it fell, so there was no way to know how deep the drop was. The tunnel was too narrow to turn around. I would have to go in head first. That was the choice then. Crawl backwards to the tunnel's beginning, past whatever waited for me there, or drop blindly head down into the black hole. Into what? A vacant shaft? An old heating duct? Panic flooded through me. The thought of being entombed inside the walls of this house brought hard gooseflesh on my arms. Was Mike down there now? Was that the voice I had just heard? I might have remained anchored to that spot forever had I not felt a breeze blowing up at me from the trap door. It smelled like night air, like air from an open window. I leaned forward impulsively, braced my legs against the side of the tunnel, and lowered myself down, arms stretched forward, a blind man's swan dive into a midnight pool. I didn't have to reach far. My hands found wooden steps just a few feet below the trap door. I pulled myself down and flipped over, hearing the trap door swing shut just above me. I stood upright on the narrow stairs, then followed them down to find myself inside another closet, this one bathed in a pale orange light. I stepped out into a room, blinking stupidly. The light was dazzling after the endless blackness of the closed tunnel. My first impression was a curtain blowing against an open window. I started toward that window, then stumbled over something and fell hard onto the floor. I turned and stared at what I had tripped over, uncomprehending at first, then recoiling. It was Mike's boot. It stood in the center of a red wax pentagram drawn on the floor. The pentagram was illuminated by an altar glowing with candles that dripped thick red tallow down its sides like exposed veins. A severed goat's head was staked to the altar, its vertical pupils staring back at me sightlessly. Its tongue protruded from the side of its mouth, and hanging around its neck was a gold chain that I knew only too well. Its pendant was Mike's patron saint, St. Christopher. Oh, Mike! A parchment lay beneath the goat's head with strange words scrawled on it. Moaning, I pulled the necklace off and threw it over my head. I ran to the window and looked out, realizing where I was. The only window not boarded up. I could see the patrol car and the barn door. It was lit up. Lying on the ground in front of that door was a flashlight, Mike's flashlight. It lay pointing at the barn like a spotlight on the main stage. As I stood fixated by the sight, an engine started up. Its vibrating hum rose into the air. What is that? I felt I should know. My brain was buckling in my panic, but words rose there. Gas, on the fresher side, I'd say. Someone said that. Who was that? A picture rose in my mind of someone crouched on the floor, touching his nose, smelling gasoline, a machine, a generator. It was a man, a big man. My friend, my partner. Outside the window, a human being screamed so piercingly loud that I almost didn't recognize the voice. I spun around and ran straight at the altar, kicking it over and scooping up the parchment and the candle without thinking. I raised the burning stub high and ran to the closed door and yanked on the knob. It was locked. Ah! I drew my gun, blew out the lock, kicked the door open, and charged down the hall, screaming. Candlelight leapt from my hand to the walls, rounding their corners and casting crooked shadows that danced grotesque pirouettes across the ceiling. I passed by countless doors, each of them flung open wide. Voices drifted from them, a chorus singing discordant hymns that rose in a tumultuous crescendo and beckoned me to join, to add my song to its dark opera. In the background, the screams went on and on. No shade rose to arrest my progress or hinder my way. The house was indifferent to me now, and I knew why. Mike was paying the price for our intrusion, paying it at this very moment. Rage eclipsed my terror as I ran through the open house. I howled profanities into the emptiness, cursing the hidden powers, daring them to show themselves. They answered with insane laughter. I came at last to the top of the staircase. Many of the floorboards were torn away, giving the appearance of a jagged, gaping mouth. From deep in its gullet I heard nonsensical chanting of harsh gibberish, keeping time with the generator's drone. In a move of inexplicable instinct, I lifted the demonic parchment and touched the candle to the page. It caught instantly, bursting into blue and black flame. And in a haze of fury and utter despair, I gathered myself and leapt over the toothy chasm, crying out Mike's name and hurling the burning abomination down into the depths. It seemed to me then that the chanting broke off into murmurs of anger and confusion. The generator's engine sputtered and went out. Only the screams continued, and my own voice joined it as I hovered over the stairless maw, gauging the distance, knowing I hadn't jumped far enough. Flames roared up from the abyss, and I felt myself falling into it, but the boards reformed under me, their broken pieces extending outwards, merging, and I came down running on solid wood, vaguely aware that the mouth had closed behind me, and I was still alive. I reached the bottom of the staircase, the spot I had last seen Mike, and sprinted down the hall. There was no flashlight needed now. The house gave off its own preternatural glow, as if wanting to help me find my way. I looked into the great room and saw the monstrous crucifix lying victimless on the floor. The life-size Christ lounged stiffly on the couch, and as I passed, he turned towards me and smiled. The front door we had broken into lay on the ground, its hinges twisted and charred. I ran over it into the night, gasping at the cool air and bringing my gun up to shoulder height as I made for the barn. I dipped down, grabbed Mike's flashlight, and burst into the barn, running across the open floor to the small door that waited for me. I rushed inside, screaming, gun drawn, eyes wide and staring, looking for the candle-bearers, the night children, the closet demons, and for a moment they seemed to be everywhere, wavering in the room before me, quaking with a dark energy, spinning wraiths that my eyes couldn't train upon. I fired everywhere, and the report of my weapon sounded incredibly far away. When my ammo was spent, I looked through the hazy smoke and saw the bottom of his feet, one of them bare, hanging just above the butchering sink. On the wall behind Mike's gutted body were words written in blood, his blood. I read them and felt the strength run out of my legs. I slid onto my knees, my eyes locked on the wall. My portable radio blared out frantic transmissions, and in the distance I could hear the wail of approaching sirens. But I didn't move. They were too late. I was too late. I looked up into Mike's face, at the glazed eyes that stared down at me. "Shakespeare?" "Mike," I sobbed. "Mike!" I felt something inside me break away and slip into the abyss. The flashlight fell from my hands and crashed to the floor. The light went out. I embraced the darkness. They say they found me there, kneeling on the floor, covered in Mike's blood, pounding on the wall and screaming the words written there. They say I was holding one of Mike's boots and that it took 3 of them to pry it out of my hands. They want to know what happened, but I can't tell them. I've tried, but the words seem to stick in my throat. They gave me a medical retirement. Some of the guys still come around, but they don't stay long. The circles under my eyes are very dark. I leave the lights on now, all of them. I don't sleep much, and I don't take the pills the doctors give me to help me sleep, because when I sleep, I dream of the house. And the house is open, you see. It's always open, just enough to let me see the darkness inside, and Mike is always standing just inside that darkness saying, "We better take a look." And of course, I go. He's my partner. And then I wake up screaming in my closet. The words come on their own. I find them on bits of paper, on my desk blotter, sometimes on the floor. I have no memory of writing them, but I see those words each time I close my eyes. Words written in blood. And when I see them, I read them out loud. Forgive us our trespasses. Forgive us our trespasses. Forgive us our trespasses. This has been a Wayward Son audio production, and we'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen. The story you just heard was conceived and written by author Anthony James Mazza and performed and recorded by Stephen Ozerchuk. If you enjoyed our presentation and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to receive information about new and upcoming performances.